Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to a series of videos in which I am reading you a book. I am reading you Barchester Towers by Anthony Trollope. And we are up to chapter 9. We're almost in double digits. And the story so far is very simple. The old bishop of Barchester died, and a new bishop was appointed by Parliament. And he is a stranger to Barchester and to all of its ways. And his personal chaplain, Mr. Slope, is an enemy to those ways. Not necessarily because of the ways themselves, but certainly in order to establish dominance. Mr. Slope preaches an infamous sermon from the pulpit of Barchester Cathedral, a sermon that takes aim at all the ways that church services have been done for the last 100 years, very much including both the preponderance of music and the pernicious habit of having absentee clerics, people who draw a full salary, but who are never there to tend to their flocks. Lines of battle have been drawn between Dr. Grantley, the archdeacon of the diocese, on one side, and Mr. Slope on the other side. And the one thing that we've commented on in our reading so far, I'm doing more than just reading this book out loud. A number of you have been in email touch with me and pointed out that fact. That fact is obvious. One of you, just the other day, mentioned that what I'm really doing here, in addition to reading the book, is teaching it, discussing it, kind of an on-the-fly mini book club. And I'm okay with that. There are plenty of audiobooks of just the text of this book. So you can expect interjections. I'll try to keep them under control. So we are up to chapter 9, which is called The Stanhope Family. And that name will be familiar to readers because the name of Dr. Vesey Stanhope, who is a cleric at Barchester, has already come up. He's come up as an example of one of those absentee clerics, someone who has been collecting butterflies on the shores of Lake Como for years without ever returning to Barchester. So this is The Stanhope Family, Chapter 9. It is now 3 months since Dr. Prouty began his reign, and changes have already been effected in the diocese which show at least the energy of an active mind. Among other things, absentee clergymen have been favored with hints much too strong to be overlooked. Poor dear old Bishop Grantley had on this matter been too lenient, and the archdeacon has never been inclined to be severe with those who were absent on reputable pretenses, or provided for their duties in a liberal way. Among the greatest of the diocesan sinners in this respect was Dr. Vesey Stanhope. Years had now passed since he had done a day's duty, and yet there was no reason against his doing duty except a want of inclination on his own part. He held a prebendal stall in the diocese, one of the best residences in the close, and the 2 large rectories of Crabtree Canonicorum and Stog Pingham. Indeed, he had the cure of 3 parishes, for that of Eiderdown was joined with Stog Pingham. He had resided in Italy for 12 years. His first going there had been attributed to a sore throat, and that sore throat, though never repeated in any violent manner, had stood him in such stead that it enabled him to live in easy idleness ever since. Because he has those 3 rectories, and all of the collections, all of the salaries, all of the rents from all of his lands, they all come to him whether he's there or not. He can pay a small fraction of those to one of his curates to do all of his duties for him and just live off the rest without ever doing anything, lifting a finger in work. He had now been summoned home. Not indeed with rough violence or by any peremptory command, but by a mandate which he found himself unable to disregard. Mr. Slope had written to him by the bishop's desire. In the first place, the bishop had much wanted the valuable cooperation of Dr. Vesey Stanhope in the diocese. In the next, the bishop thought it his imperative duty to become personally acquainted with the most conspicuous of his diocesan clergy. Then the bishop thought it essentially necessary, for Dr. Stanhope's own interest, that Dr. Stanhope would at any rate for a time return to Barchester. And lastly, it was said that so strong a feeling was at the present moment evinced by the hierarchs of the church with reference to the absence of its clerical members, that it behooved Dr. Vesey Stanhope not to allow his name to stand among those which would probably in a few months be submitted to the councils of the nation. There was something so ambiguously frightful in this last threat that Dr. Stanhope determined to spend 2 or 3 summer months in his residence at Barchester. His rectories were inhabited by his curates, and he felt himself from disuse to be unfit for parochial duty. But his prebendal home was at present empty, and he thought it probable that he might be able now and again to preach a prebendal sermon. He arrived, therefore, with all his family at Barchester, and he and they must be introduced to my readers, meaning they're going to be important in the novel, because other people are being called home too. We're getting the focus on the Stanhope family because finally we are getting some kind of other plot being kicked off. The great family characteristic of the Stanhopes might probably be said to be heartlessness. But this want of feeling was, in most of them, accompanied by so great an amount of good nature as to make itself but little noticeable to the world. They were so prone to oblige their neighbors that their neighbors failed to perceive how indifferent to them was the happiness or well-being of those around them. The Stanhopes could visit you in your sickness, provided it were not contagious, bring you oranges, French novels, the last new bit of scandal, and then hear of your death or your recovery with equally indifferent composure. Their conduct to each other was the same as to the world. They bore and forbore, and there was sometimes, as will be seen, much necessity for forbearing, but their love among themselves rarely reached above this. It is astonishing how much each of the family was able to do, and how much each did to prevent the well-being of the other four. There were 5 in all, the doctor, namely, and Mrs. Stanhope, 2 daughters and 1 son. The doctor, perhaps, was the least singular and most estimable of them all, and yet such good qualities as he possessed were all negative. He was good-looking in a rather plethoric way, at about 60 years of age. His hair was snow-white, very plentiful, and somewhat like wool of the finest description. His whiskers were very large and very white, and gave to his face the appearance of a benevolent, sleepy old lion. His dress was always unexceptionable. Though he had lived so many years in Italy, it was invariably of decent clerical hue, but it was never hyper-clerical. He was a man not given to much talking, but what little he did say was generally well said. His reading seldom went beyond romances and poetry of the lightest and not always most moral description. He was thoroughly a bon vivant, an accomplished judge of wine, and though he never drank to excess, and a most inexorable critic of all affairs touching the kitchen. He had had much to forgive in his own family, since a family had grown up around him, and had forgiven everything except inattention to his dinner. His weakness in that respect was now fully understood, and his temper but seldom tried. As Dr. Stanhope was a clergyman, it may be supposed that his religious convictions made up a considerable part of his character, but this was not so. I don't know why you'd presume that in Barchester Towers as we've read it so far. That he had religious convictions must be believed, but he rarely obtruded them even on his children. This abstinence on his part was not systematic, but very characteristic of the man. It was not that he had predetermined never to influence their thoughts, but he had so habitually idle that his time for doing so had never come till the opportunity for doing so was gone forever. Whatever conviction the father may have had, the children were at any rate but indifferent members of the church from which he drew his income. Such was Dr. Stanhope. The features of Mrs. Stanhope's character were even less plainly marked than those of her lord. The do-nothing attitude of her Italian life had entered her very soul and brought her to regard a state of inactivity as the only earthly good. Her dress was always perfect. She never dressed but once in the day and never appeared till between 3 and 4, but when she did appear, she appeared at her best. Whether her toil rested partly with her or wholly with her handmaid is not for such a one as the author even to imagine. The structure of her attire was always elaborate, and yet never overlabored. She was rich in apparel, but not bedizened by finery. Her ornaments were costly, rare, and such as could not fail to attract notice, but they did not look as though they were worn for that purpose. She well knew the great architectural secret of decorating her constructions, and never descended to construct a decoration. Did you follow that? That's rather good. This is all faffing about. This is all nonsense prose, but that was rather good. Let's read that again. She well knew the great architectural secret of decorating her constructions, and never descended to construct a decoration. But when we have said that Mrs. Stanhope knew how to dress and used her knowledge daily, we have said all. Other purpose in life she had none. It was something, indeed, that she did not interfere with the purposes of others. In early life she had undergone great trials with reference to the doctor's dinners, but for the last 10 or 12 years her eldest daughter Charlotte had taken that labor off her hands, and she had little to trouble her. Little, that is, till the edict of this terrible English journey had gone forth. Since then, indeed, her life had been laborious enough, For such a one, the toil of being carried from the shores of Como to the city of Barchester is more than labor enough, let the care of the carriers be ever so vigilant. Mrs. Stanhope had been obliged to have every one of her dresses taken in from the effects of the journey. Charlotte Stanhope was at this time about 35 years old, and whatever may be her faults, she had none of those which belong particularly to old young ladies. Charlotte is referring to a woman in her 30s as an old young lady. She neither dressed young, nor talked young, nor indeed looked young. She appeared to be perfectly content with her time of life, and in no way affected the graces of youth. She was a fine young woman, and had she been a man, she would have been a very fine young man. All that was done in the house, and all that was done by the servants, was done by her. She gave the orders, paid the bills, hired and dismissed the domestics, made the tea, carved the meat, and managed everything in the Stanhope household. She, and she alone, could ever induce her father to look into the state of his worldly concerns. She, and she alone, could in any degree control the absurdities of her sister. She, and she alone, prevented the whole family from falling into utter disrepute and beggary. It was by her advice that they now found themselves very unpleasantly situated in Barchester. Presuming that if Charlotte hadn't been there and Dr. Vesey Stanhope had got that edict from Mr. Slope, he'd have ignored it. To his ruin. But anyway, so far the character of Charlotte Stanhope is not unprepossessing. But it remains to be said that the influence which she had had on her family, though it was used to a certain extent for their worldly well-being, had not been used to their real benefit, as it might have been. She had aided her father in his indifference to his professional duties, counseling him that his livings were as much his own individual property as the estates of his elder brother were the property of that worthy peer. So Dr. Vesey Stanhope is the younger son of a peer. But that statement that his livings are his own property is absolutely false. She had for years past stifled every little rising wish for a return to England which the doctor had from time to time expressed. She had encouraged her mother in her idleness in order that she herself might be the mistress and manager of the Stanhope household. She had encouraged and fostered the follies of her sister, though she was always willing and often able to protect her from their probable results. She had done her best and had thoroughly succeeded in spoiling her brother and turning him loose upon a world, an idle man without a profession and without a single shilling to call his own. Miss Stanhope was a clever woman, able to talk on most subjects and quite indifferent to what the subject was. She prided herself on her freedom from English prejudice, and she might have added from feminine delicacy. On religion she was a pure free thinker, and with much want of true affection, delighted to throw out her own views before the troubled mind of her father. To have shaken what remained of his Church of England faith would have gratified her much, but the idea of his abandoning his preferment in the Church had never once presented itself to her mind. How could he, indeed, when he had no income of any other source? But the two most prominent members of the family still remain to be described. The second child had been christened Madeline, and had been a great beauty. We need not say had been, for she was never more beautiful than the time in which we write, though her person for many years had been disfigured by an accident. It is unnecessary that we should give in detail the early history of Madeline Stanhope. She had gone to Italy when about 17 years of age, and had been allowed to make the most of her surpassing beauty in the salons of Milan, among the crowded villas along the shores of Lake Como. She had become famous for adventures in which her character was just not lost, and had destroyed the hearts of a dozen cavaliers without once being touched in her own. Blood had flowed in quarrels about her charms, and she heard of these encounters with pleasurable excitement. It had been told of her that on one occasion she had stood by in the disguise of a page and had seen her lover fall. As is so often the case, she had married the very worst of those who had sought her hand. Why she had chosen Paolo Neroni, a man of no birth and no property, a mere captain in the Pope's Guard, one who had come up to Milan either simply as an adventurer or else as a spy, a man of harsh temper and oily manners, mean in figure, swarthy in face, and so false in words as to be hourly detected, need not now be told. I'd like to know it. Their story would be interesting to read. When the moment for doing so came, she had probably had no alternative. He, at any rate, had become her husband, and after a prolonged honeymoon among the lakes, they had gone together to Rome, the papal captain having vainly endeavored to induce his wife to remain behind him. 6 months afterwards, she arrived at her father's house, a cripple and a mother. That's what he means by she had no choice but to marry him. She had arrived without even notice, and with hardly clothes to cover her, and without one of those many ornaments which had graced her bridal trousseau. Her baby was in the arms of a poor girl from Milan, who she had taken in exchange for the Roman maid who had accompanied her thus far, and who had then, as her mistress said, become homesick and had returned. It was clear that the lady had determined that there should be no witnesses to tell stories of her life in Rome. She had fallen, she said, in ascending a ruin, and had fatally injured the sinews of her knee, so fatally that when she stood she lost 8 inches of her accustomed height, so fatally that when she essayed to move she could only drag herself painfully along with protruded hip and extended foot in a manner less graceful than that of a hunchback. She had consequently made up her mind once and forever that she would never stand and never attempt to move herself. Stories were not slow to follow her, averring that she had been cruelly used by Neroni, and that to his violence she owed her accident. Be that as it may, little had been said about her husband, but that little had made it clearly intelligible to the family that Signor Neroni was to be seen and heard of no more. There was no question as to readmitting the poor ill-used beauty to her old family rights, no question as to adopting her infant daughter beneath the Stanhope roof. Though heartless, the Stanhopes were not selfish. The two were taken in, petted, made much of for a time, all but adored, and then felt by the two parents to be great nuisances in the house. But in the house the lady was, and there she remained, having her own way, though that way was not very comfortable for the customary usages of an English clergyman. Madame Neroni, though forced to give up all motion in the world, had no intention whatever of giving up the world itself. The beauty of her face was uninjured, and that beauty was of a peculiar kind. Her copious, rich brown hair was worn in Grecian bandeaux round her head, displaying as much as possible of her forehead and cheeks. Her forehead, though rather low, was very beautiful from its perfect contour and pearly whiteness. Her eyes were long and large and marvelously bright. Might I venture to say, bright as Lucifer's? I should perhaps best express the depth of their brilliancy. They were dreadful eyes to look at, such as would absolutely deter any man of mind and easy spirit from attempting a passage of arms with such foes. There was talent in them, and the fire of passion, and the play of wit, but there was no love. Cruelty was there instead, and courage of a desire of masterhood, cunning, and a wish for mischief. And yet, as eyes, they were very beautiful. The eyelashes were long and perfect, and the long, steady, unabashed gaze with which she would look into the face of her admirer fascinated while it frightened him. She was a basilisk, from whom an ardent lover of beauty could make no escape. Her nose and mouth and teeth and chin and neck and bust were perfect, much more so at 28 than they had been at 18. What wonder that such charms still glowing in her face, and with such deformity destroying her figure, she would resolve to be seen, but only to be seen reclining on a sofa. Her resolve had not been carried out without difficulty. She had still frequented the opera at Milan. She had still been seen occasionally in the salons of the noble. She had caused herself to be carried in and out from her carriage, and that in such a manner as in no wise to disturb her charms, disarrange her dress, or expose her deformities. Her sister always accompanied her, and a maid, and a manservant also, on state occasions, too. It was impossible that her purpose could have been achieved with less, and yet, poor as she was, she had achieved her purpose. And then again, and more dissolute Italian youths of Milan frequented the Stanhope villa and surrounded her couch, not greatly to her father's satisfaction. Sometimes his spirit would rise, and a dark spot would show itself on his cheek, and he would rebel. But Charlotte would assuage him with some peculiar triumph of her culinary art, and again all would be smooth for a while. Madeline affected all manner of rich and quaint devices, in the garniture of her room, her person, and her feminine belongings. In nothing was this more apparent than in the visiting card which she had prepared for her use. For such an article, one would say that she, in her present state, could have but small need, seeing how improbable it was that she would make a morning call. But not such was her own opinion. Her card was surrounded by a deep border of gilding, on which she had imprinted 3 lines: La Signora Madeline Vesey Neroni, nata Stanhope. And over that name she had a bright gilt coronet, which certainly looked very magnificent. How she had come to concoct such a name for herself it would be difficult to explain. Her father had been christened Vesey, as another man is christened Thomas, and she had no more right to assume it than it would have the daughter of a Mr. Josiah Jones to call herself Mrs. Josiah Smith on marrying a man of the latter name. We stumble here because this is all nonsense. All of this is nonsense. Who on earth cares about Madeline Stanhope's visiting card? Anyway, anyway, Paolo Neroni had had not the faintest title to call himself a scion of even Italian nobility. Had the pair met in England, Neroni would probably have been a count, but they had met in Italy, and any such pretense on his part would have been simply ridiculous. A coronet, however, was a pretty ornament, and if it could solace a poor cripple to have such on her card, who could begrudge it to her? Of her husband, or of his individual family, she never spoke, but with her admirers she would often allude in a mysterious way to her married life and isolated state, and, pointing to her daughter, would call her the last of the blood of the emperors, thus referring Neroni's extraction to the old Roman family from which the four worst of the Caesars had sprung. The signora was not without talent, and not without a certain sort of industry. She was an indomitable letter writer, and her letters were worth the postage. They were full of wit and mischief, satire, love, latitudinarian philosophy, free religion, and sometimes, alas, loose ribaldry. The subject, however, depended entirely on the recipient, and she was prepared to correspond with anyone but moral young ladies and stiff old women. She wrote also a kind of poetry, generally in Italian, and short romances, generally in French. She read much of a desultory sort of literature, and as a modern linguist had really made great proficiency. Such was the lady who had now come to wound the hearts of the men of Barchester. And we know that she's going to, because Trollope has just given us 5 times as much space on her as on any other member of the family. That's your foremost signal that these are not just incidental descriptions. One more member of the family to get through. Ethelbert Stanhope was in some respects like his younger sister, but he was less inestimable as a man than she as a woman. His great fault was an entire absence of that principle which should have induced him, as the son of a man without a fortune, to earn his own bread. Many attempts had been made to get him to do so, but these had all been frustrated, not so much by idleness on his part as by a disinclination to exert himself in any way not to his taste. He had been educated at Eton, and had been intended for the church, but had left Cambridge in disgust after a single term, and notified to his father his intention to study for the bar. Preparatory to that, he thought it well he should attend a German university, and consequently went to Leipzig. There he remained 2 years, and brought away a knowledge of German and a taste for the fine arts. He still, however, intended himself for the bar, took chambers, engaged himself to sit at the feet of some learned pundit, and spent a season in London. He there found that all his aptitudes inclined himself to the life of an artist, and he determined to live by painting. With this object he returned to Milan, and he had himself rigged out for Rome. As a painter, he might have earned his bread, for he wanted only diligence to excel. But when at Rome, his mind was carried away by other things. He soon wrote home for money, saying that he had been converted to the mother church, that he had already an acolyte of the Jesuits, and that he was about to start with others to Palestine on a mission for converting Jews. He did go to Judea, but was unable to convert the Jews, but being unable to convert the Jews, was converted by them. He again wrote home to say that Moses was the only giver of perfect law to the world, that the coming of the true Messiah was at hand, that the great things were being done in Palestine, and that he had met one of the family of Sidonia, a most respectable man who was now on his way to Western Europe, and whom he had induced to deviate from his route with the object of calling at the Stanhope Villa. Ethelbert then expressed his hope that his mother and sisters would listen to this wonderful prophet. His father, he knew, could not do so for pecuniary considerations. Never crosses his mind that his father might not want to hear about the truth of Judaism, since he is actually a high cleric in the Church of England. This Sidonia, however, did not take so strong a fancy to him as another of that family did once to a young English nobleman. A lot is being alluded to here. You don't need to worry about it. At least he provided him with no heaps of gold as large as lions, so that the Judaized Ethelbert was once again obliged to draw on the revenues of the Christian church. It is needless to tell how the father swore that he would send no more money and receive no Jew, nor how Charlotte declared that Ethelbert could not be left penniless in Jerusalem, and how La Signora Neroni resolved to have Sidonia at her feet. The money was sent, and the Jew did come. The Jew did come, but he was not at all to the taste of La Signora. He was a dirty little old man, and though he provided no golden lions, he had, it seemed, relieved young Stanhope's necessities. He positively refused to leave the villa till he had got a bill for the doctor on his London bankers. Ethelbert did not long remain a Jew. He soon reappeared at the villa without prejudices on the subject of his religion, and with a firm resolve to achieve fame and fortune as a sculptor. He brought with him some models which he had originated in Rome, and which really gave such a fair promise that his father was induced to go to further expense in furthering these views. Ethelbert opened an establishment, or rather took lodgings at a workshop, at Carrara, and there spoilt much marble and made a few pretty things. Since that period, now 4 years ago, he had alternated between Carrara and the villa, but his sojourns to the workshop became shorter and shorter, and those at the villa longer and longer. 'Twas no wonder, for Carrara is not a spot in which an Englishman would like to dwell. When the family started for England, he had resolved not to be left behind, and with the assistance of his elder sister, he had carried his point against his father's wishes. It was necessary, he said, that he should come to England for orders. How otherwise was he to bring his profession to account? In other words, he'll get clients for his sculpture in England. In personal appearance, Ethelbert Stanhope was the most singular of beings. He was certainly very handsome. He had his sister Madeline's eyes without their stare, and without their hard cunning and cruel firmness. They were also very much lighter, and of so clear a blue as to make his face remarkable, if nothing else did so. On entering a room with him, Ethelbert's blue eyes would be the first thing you would see, and on leaving it, almost the last thing you would forget. His light hair was very long and silky, coming down over his coat. His beard had been prepared in the Holy Land and was patriarchal. He never shaved, and rarely trimmed it. It was glossy, soft, clean, altogether not unprepossessing. It was such that ladies might desire to reel it off and work on their patterns in lieu of floss silk. His complexion was fair and almost pink, and he was small in height and slender in limb, but well made, and his voice was of peculiar sweetness. In manner and dress he was equally remarkable. He had none of the false modesty of an Englishman. He required no introduction to make himself agreeable to any person. He habitually addressed strangers, ladies as well as men, without any such formality, and in doing so never seemed to meet with rebuke. His costume cannot be described because it was so various, but it was always totally opposed to every principle of color and construction of the dress of those with whom he had for a time consorted. He was habitually addicted to making love to ladies, and did so without any scruple of conscience, or any idea that such a practice was amiss. He had no heart to touch himself, and was literally unaware that humanity was subject to such an affliction. He had not thought much about it, but, had he been asked, he would have said that ill-treating a young lady's heart meant injuring her promotion in the world. His principles, therefore, forbade him to pay attention to a girl if he thought any man was present whom it might suit her to marry. In this manner, his good nature frequently interfered with his amusement, but he had no other motives for abstaining from the fullest declarations of love to every girl that pleased his eye. Bertie Stanhope, as he was generally called, however, popular with both sexes, and with Italians as well as English. His circle of acquaintance was very large, and embraced people of all sorts. He had no respect for rank, and no aversion to those below him. He had lived on familiar terms with English peers, German shopkeepers, and Roman priests. All people were nearly alike to him. He was above, or rather below, all prejudices. No virtue could charm him, no vice shock him. He had about him a natural good manner, which seemed to qualify him for the highest circles, and yet he was never out of place in the lowest. He had no principle, no regard for others, no self-respect, no desire to be other than a drone in a hive, if only he could, as a drone, get what honey was sufficient for him. Of honey, in his latter days, it may probably be presaged he will have but short allowance. Such was the family of the Stanhopes, who, at this period, suddenly joined themselves to the ecclesiastical circle of Barchester Close. Any stranger union it would be impossible perhaps to conceive, and it was not that as though they fell down into the cathedral precincts, hitherto untalked of or unknown. In such case, no amalgamation could have been at all probable between the newcomers and either the Proudie set or the Grantley set, but such was far from being the case. The Stanhopes were all known by name in Barchester, and Barchester was prepared to receive them with open arms. The doctor was one of her prebendaries, one of her rectors, one of her pillars of strength, and was, moreover, counted on as a sure ally by the Proudies and the Grantleys. He himself was the brother of one peer, and his wife was the sister of another, and both of these peers were lords of Whiggish tendency, with whom the new bishop had some alliance. This was sufficient to give Mr. Slope a high hope that he might enlist Dr. Stanhope on his side before his enemies could outmaneuver him. On the other hand, the old dean had many years ago, in the days of the doctor's clerical energies, been instrumental in assisting him in his views as to preferment, And many, many years ago also, the two doctors, Stanhope and Grantley, had, as young parsons, been joyous together in the common rooms of Oxford. Dr. Grantley, consequently, did not doubt that the newcomer would range himself under his banners. Little did any of them dream of what ingredients the Stanhope family was now composed. And that is chapter 9. We return to a long description of characters. Trollope routinely does that in this book and lots of other books, where if he has a character to introduce you, he will do it for the whole of a chapter. That chapter on the Vesey family, to put it mildly, is compressible. But the point here is not only to allow, that's wonderful, it's wonderful, wonderful prose. So the point here is not only to allow Trollope to do that. This is the kind of tale-telling, background filling in Trollope that his readers love. It's not only to do that, but it's also to fill out pages. It's to get him to his word count for the serialization that where these chapters originally saw the light. So that is the Stanhope family, the family of Dr. Vesey Stanhope. And we can tell just from that description that Charlotte probably won't have much to do with the remainder of the book, but young Bertie and certainly La Signora will have a lot to do with the coming events of the book. And now we'll move on from there. We'll see what Trollope has for us in the next chapter. Will it be another such expositional chapter, or will we get back to the war in Barchester? We'll find out. That was a little longer chapter than normal, but we'll find out next time. And I will see you then. Thank you, BookTube.